Good evening. The Queen has opened a new session of Parliament for the second time in the space of 2 months. But this time, there was less pageantry and far more politics following the Conservative victory in last week's election. Some 30 bills were announced in the speech, advertised as an ambitious programme of domestic reform, as well as delivering Brexit. Top of the list was the commitment to take the UK out of the EU by the end of January. There'll be increases in the NHS budget in England, and those will be enshrined in law. There was confirmation of the Conservative campaign pledge to impose longer sentences for violent offenders, but also a major review of the criminal justice system. In a moment, we'll look at some of those pledges, and we'll be assessing how realistic they are. But first, here's our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, on the events of the day at Westminster.
Even the Crown gets its very own Rolls-Royce, the trappings of Westminster's great royal occasion. A moment to savour for the new government.
It's certainly a feast.
A time of agony for the opposition.
So I'm going to ask this policeman to let me through, but not you.
The trumpets blast their usual note, the ritual summoning MPs to hear the monarch. The same as ever. But the reminders of the past ought not to hide the reality that history has just been made. The defeated leader of the opposition seemed too angry to exchange a hello with this all-powerful Prime Minister, whose number one job is to take us out of the European Union.
My government's priority is to deliver the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of January. My ministers will bring forward legislation to ensure the United Kingdom's exit on that date and to make the most of the opportunities that this brings for all the people of the United Kingdom.
But then what? The wrangle of difficult trade talks, of course, and extra cash for the health service put into law.
For the first time, the National Health Service's multi-year funding settlement, agreed earlier this year, will be enshrined in law.
Tougher sentencing, a cut to business rates, a new immigration system, just some of the long list of work ahead. But after a torrid few years, listen to this bland-sounding announcement.
A Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission will be established.
Might his government be tempted to use their huge majority to overhaul how this whole place works? Maybe. This will not be a safety-first government, willing to dare, determined to plan not just for 5 years, but for a decade.
This is not a programme for 1 year or one parliament. It is a blueprint for the future of Britain. Just imagine where this country could be in 10 years' time. And after the dither, after the delay, after the deadlock, after the paralysis and the platitudes, the time has come for change and the time has come for action. And it is action that the British people will get from this gracious speech, this most gracious speech, and I commend it to the House.
Raucous Tory benches. Misery on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the government is actually proposing is woefully inadequate for the scale of the problems that this country faces. As this government ploughs ahead with its programme of gimmicks and false promises, we will be holding them to account every step of the way and campaigning inside and outside Parliament and across this country for the real change that this government sadly will not deliver, but that our country so desperately needs.
Derision at the other side. Brewing tension with the SNP too.
Now Scotland must have the chance to choose its own future. One shackled to the Brexit destruction imposed by Westminster, or one with hope, with opportunity and ambition, an independent Scotland in the European Union.
Yeah. Yet, with a majority of 80, Boris Johnson need not lose much sleep over getting his way in this place, at least most of the time. He need not worry day to day about keeping his place, his authority. But that's not the same as turning his chance into a success, making the most of this next few years as something that really counts. The pressure's on the Prime Minister to prove to voters who backed him that they were right. Far from packing up, this is a government that's only getting going. Today may not be the limit of its ambitions, but just the start.
Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in all, the Queen's speech contained more than 30 bills. That's not a record, but it's certainly many more than in recent years. Aside from the big pledges on Brexit and the NHS, there were also some specific items on the government's list of priorities. There'll be bills to raise the point at which people start paying national insurance and to increase the national living wage. People who rent their homes from private landlords will get more protection. And there'll be a new points-based immigration system aimed at attracting the skills that the government says Britain needs. So what do today's pledges mean for the NHS or for the criminal justice system and for business? In a moment, we'll hear from our business correspondent Dharshini David and our home editor Mark Easton. But first, let's start with our health editor Hugh Pym with his assessment.
After all the election pledges on the NHS, the Conservative government has now set out its immediate priorities. One of them is legislation to underpin the promise to spend nearly £34 billion a year more in cash terms on the NHS in England by 2023. The message to voters seems to be, if you're doubtful, well, here's a law to ensure we do it. What's more, the average annual real terms increase is 3.4%. Above recent years, but still a little way short of the historic long-run NHS average. Then there's social care, so important for the health service. There's nothing beyond the plan to have cross-party talks on long-term funding solutions. Detailed policies seem some way off.
The public are worried about violent crime and terrorism. The government's response is more police, more stop and search, longer sentences and more prison places. They want to sound uncompromising and tough. But dig a bit deeper into the policies announced today, and it seems that ministers also want to keep their options open. Announcing a royal commission into the whole criminal justice system for England and Wales suggests they accept the system simply isn't working properly at the moment, reflected perhaps in a series of recent scandals. A review like this will take time. Ministers will be hoping it diffuses crime as an issue and provides political protection when things inevitably go wrong.
Can the government afford this? Well, its new plans are relatively modest, perhaps a sign of how bare the Chancellor's cupboard is getting. On top of the plans for public services, there's an extra £85 per year for workers in the form of national insurance changes. And there's some concessions to the high street too in the form of business rates, but only for a year and only to the tune of £320 million, just 1% of the annual bill all companies face. All these plans together cost about £7 billion. And the companies are going to face most of this bill in the form of that council cut to corporation tax. But the government might find itself struggling to balance the books within 3 years as it hopes on day-to-day spending, given the scale of its pledges.
Well, in the wake of his election victory, the Prime Minister thanked the former Labour voters who, as he put it, had lent him their votes. And today he pledged to repay their trust. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas has been to Lee, a Conservative gain at the election, to find out what people made of today's announcements.
Change. Like when the last Lancashire pithead closed in 1970. Or when Lee's railway station shut 50 years ago. And then last week, when many here turned from Labour, electing their first ever Conservative MP. A northern town changing its mind.
And that's closed down this year.
Mike's been a jeweller for 3 years.
We've also got the money shop that's closed down.
He's seen the decline of the high street.
They've closed down in the last 12 months.
He says he voted Conservative last week for the first time because of a belief in Boris Johnson.
Just getting people back out on the high street shopping, helping the average person, helping these small businesses to thrive.
In the first half of this year, 98 shops opened and 173 closed across the northwest of England, an increase of almost 30% compared to the same period last year. For Mike, today's pledge from the government to cut business rates is crucial.
Without it, could you potentially go out of business?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. It has been a real worry for us.
The NHS dominated the Queen's speech.
Hello, good morning.
A loud government commitment for extra funding. At this GP surgery, Dr. Imohi is facing increasing demand.
The problems are really acute. There's a lot of winter pressures, shortage of GPs. It means the GPs are on ground have to do more work.
So are you relieved looking at the Queen's speech today?
I'm a positive person, so I'm trying to be, look at the bigger picture.
There's immense pressure. The number of requests for elderly social care to Wigan Council rose from 5,300 to 7,520 in 2 years. That's around a 40% increase compared to the average increase in England of 4.5%.
Boris Johnson's pitch now is to help towns like Leigh, towns that have gone from red to blue. Do you believe it?
Unbelievable if he could do it. It'd be great. The town would love that. But it's whether or not that happens.
I'm so glad that we've actually voted Conservative for a change.
For a change, but they've been in power for the past 9 years.
But not in Leigh, they haven't.
The story of Leigh is being told in towns across the north of England, Wales and the Midlands. Many here now expect change and something to show for their votes. Ed Thomas, BBC News, Leigh.
Well, the Prime Minister has again rejected the suggestion that Scotland should be allowed to hold another referendum on independence. Earlier today, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, laid out what she said was an unarguable case for another vote, given her party's success in the general election, and warned Mr Johnson not to block the will of the Scottish people. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, picks up the story.
When should Scottish voters get another say on whether they want to live in an independent country? That choice should be up to Scotland, says Nicola Sturgeon,
Good morning.
buoyed by her victory in last week's election.
I accept that the case for independence is yet to be won. But the election last week put beyond any reasonable argument our mandate to offer people in Scotland that choice.
If the Prime Minister refuses to transfer the powers you want, you could be stuck in a constitutional standoff for 5 years before you could have a referendum.
Well, look, Sarah, that's not my intention, because I also know that the more a Tory government seeks to block the will of the Scottish people, the more they show complete and utter contempt for Scottish democracy, the more support for independence will rise.
This paper makes the case for the power to hold another vote to be transferred to Scotland, and a copy has today been sent to Boris Johnson. Nicola Sturgeon knows the Prime Minister doesn't even need to read this document before he'll issue a flat no to the idea of another independence referendum. But what she's hoping is the longer Westminster refuse to allow that vote, the more she thinks that will increase support for Scottish independence. Boris Johnson is clearly prepared to take that risk.
I think it was Nicola Sturgeon herself who said that the referendum in 2014 was a once-in-a-generation event. And I don't know about you, Mr Speaker, but I feel that the Scottish Nationalist Party should concentrate more on delivering on the domestic priorities of the people of Scotland and rather less on breaking up our United Kingdom.
Even the dogs in the street know there will be another referendum, claims Scotland's First Minister. But there's no reason to believe Westminster will agree to one anytime soon. We could be stuck in this never-ending for years to come. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Edinburgh.